Picture this. The year is 415 before the Common Era, and the mighty Athenian fleet, a symbol of unmatched naval power, sets sail for Sicily with dreams of glory. Thousands of soldiers, hundreds of ships, all marching toward what should have been a swift victory. But within 2 years, that same fleet lies in ruins, its soldiers dead or enslaved, and the once great Athenian empire teeters on the brink of collapse. How did it all go so wrong? This wasn't just a defeat, it was a catastrophic failure that echoed through history, reshaping the balance of power in the ancient world. And it's just one of countless moments where the tides of battle turned not from lack of courage, but from sheer miscalculation, hubris, or plain bad luck. What if these battles had gone differently? What if a single decision, a stray arrow, or a change in the weather had altered the course of history? The truth is, some of the most pivotal moments in our past weren't triumphs, they were spectacular failures. From the overconfidence of generals to the arrogance of empires, these blunders didn't just change the outcome of wars, they redirected the flow of civilizations. And today, we're diving deep into 25 of the most epic military failures in ancient history, battles so disastrous, so consequential, that their echoes still resonate centuries later. This isn't just a list of defeats, it's a journey through the fragile nature of power, the cost of arrogance, and the unpredictable twists of fate. Each of these failures holds lessons about strategy, leadership, and the thin line between victory and ruin. Some were caused by sheer bad luck, others by reckless ambition, but all of them left an indelible mark on the world. So join me as we uncover the battles that should have been won, the empires that crumbled from a single misstep, and the moments where history hung in the balance. Because sometimes it's the failures, not the victories, that teach us the most. The Persian Empire was the undisputed superpower of its day, a sprawling force that had crushed rebellions and conquered kingdoms from Egypt to the Indus Valley. So when King Darius sent his army to punish Athens for supporting a revolt in Ionia, victory seemed inevitable. The Persians landed at Marathon with a force at least twice the size of the Athenian defenders, backed by legendary cavalry and archers. But numbers alone don't win battles. The Greeks, though heavily outnumbered, had one critical advantage: they knew the land. While the Persians camped on the open coastal plain, ideal for their mobile cavalry, the Athenian general Miltiades lured them into a fatal mistake. He positioned his hoplites, heavily armored infantry, on the higher ground, forcing the Persians to fight on uneven terrain where their cavalry couldn't maneuver. When the attack came, it was sheer audacity. Against all convention, Miltiades ordered his center to thin out, strengthening the flanks. As Herodotus recounts, the Persian commanders laughed at the Greeks' reckless charge, until their arrows bounced harmlessly off the hoplites' bronze armor. The Greek flanks collapsed inward like a vise, trapping the Persians in a slaughter so complete that 6,000 Persian soldiers fell compared to just 192 Athenians. That disbelief Herodotus describes, it wasn't just shock, it was the moment Persia learned that discipline and terrain could trump sheer numbers. This wasn't just a battle won, it was a future saved. Had Athens fallen, the Persian march into Greece might have extinguished the fledgling democracy that would later inspire the modern world. Instead, the victory at Marathon bought Greece precious time to unite, to prepare, and to face Persia again a decade later. But Darius' successors wouldn't repeat the same mistakes. Their next invasion would be even larger, even more ruthless, and set the stage for one of history's most legendary last stands. 10 years after Marathon, Persia returned, but this time the stakes were even higher. Xerxes, the new king, assembled an army so vast it supposedly drank rivers dry as it marched. His target, the narrow mountain pass at Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans and their allies stood between Persia and the heart of Greece. The numbers couldn't have been more lopsided. Modern estimates suggest Xerxes commanded anywhere from 100,000 to 300,000 troops, while Leonidas had just 7,000. Yet for 3 brutal days, the Greeks held the line, turning the pass into a slaughterhouse where Persian waves broke against Spartan shields. But here's the twist: Thermopylae wasn't just a heroic last stand, it was a Persian failure in disguise. Yes, Xerxes eventually broke through, but at what cost? Plutarch later wrote that the Spartans' defiance became a moral victory, rallying Greece against a common enemy. The Persian king had expected a quick submission. Instead, he got a bloodbath that drained his army's morale. Worse, his navy, the real key to controlling Greece, failed to flank the Greeks early, wasting precious time. When the Persians finally forced the pass, their momentum was already shattered. The delay gave Athens time to evacuate, and the Greek fleet time to regroup at Salamis, where they'd soon deliver a crushing blow. Thermopylae's legacy isn't just about bravery, it's about how even a win can plant the seeds of defeat. Xerxes took the pass, but he lost something far more valuable: the illusion of invincibility. His troops had seen their best warriors fall to a handful of Greeks, and that doubt festered. Meanwhile, the Spartan sacrifice became a rallying cry, uniting fractious city-states against Persia. It's a lesson history keeps teaching. Overwhelming force means nothing if your enemy refuses to break. And as we'll see next, when pride overrules strategy, even the mightiest fleets can sink themselves. The Sicilian Expedition was meant to be Athens' crowning achievement, a bold strike to cripple Sparta's ally Syracuse and secure dominance over the Mediterranean. Instead, it became a textbook example of how arrogance and indecision can turn ambition into catastrophe. The mastermind behind the campaign, Alcibiades, was a brilliant but reckless strategist whose personal scandals would soon overshadow his military genius. Just as the massive Athenian fleet prepared to sail, rumors spread that Alcibiades had defaced sacred statues in Athens, a sacrilege that threatened divine wrath. Forced to return for trial, he fled to Sparta, where he promptly revealed Athens' entire battle plan. Meanwhile, command fell to Nicias, a cautious general who had opposed the expedition from the start. His reluctance to act decisively would prove just as disastrous as Alcibiades' betrayal. Thucydides' account of what followed reads like a slow-motion tragedy. The Athenians, confident in their naval superiority, ignored Syracuse's formidable defenses, thick walls, strategic high ground, and a harbor easily sealed off by chains. Worse, they failed to secure reliable supply lines, assuming they could forage or bully Sicilian cities into submission. But Syracuse wasn't some backwater. It was a wealthy, well-fortified power with Spartan advisors, including none other than Alcibiades himself. When the Athenians finally attacked, their initial assaults faltered against Syracuse's innovative countermeasures, like hidden stakes in the harbor to gut their ships' hulls. As months dragged on, Nicias' hesitation became paralyzing. He delayed retreats, fearing political backlash in Athens, while disease and desertion ravaged his forces. By the time he ordered a withdrawal, it was too late. Syracuse's navy blockaded the harbor, trapping the Athenians. Thucydides describes the final retreat as pure nightmare, thousands of starving, demoralized soldiers stumbling through hostile terrain, picked off by Sicilian cavalry. The few survivors were thrown into Syracuse's stone quarries, left to die under the scorching sun. Of the 40,000 Athenians who set out, barely a fraction returned. The ripple effects were immediate and devastating. Athens' treasury was drained, its navy crippled, and its prestige shattered. Sparta, sensing weakness, redoubled its attacks, leading to Athens' eventual surrender in 404 before the Common Era. But perhaps the most haunting lesson here is how often history repeats itself. Centuries later, Rome would echo Athens' mistakes in its own ill-fated invasion of Carthage, underestimating an enemy, overextending supply lines, and letting internal rivalries cloud judgment. Because when empires let hubris override strategy, the outcome is almost always written in defeat. Rome had never seen a defeat like Cannae. In the blistering summer of 216 before the Common Era, the Republic's legions, 80,000 strong, marched onto the dusty plains of southern Italy, confident they would crush Hannibal's ragged band of mercenaries once and for all. The Carthaginian general had already humiliated Rome at Trebia and Lake Trasimene, but this time the consuls Paulus and Varro were determined to overwhelm him with sheer numbers. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a masterclass in annihilation, a slaughter so complete it became the stuff of military legend. Hannibal's genius lay in turning Rome's greatest strength, its rigid, disciplined formations, into its fatal weakness. As Polybius recounts, he deliberately positioned his weaker infantry at the center, baiting the Romans to push forward while his elite African troops held the flanks. The legions, packed tightly in their traditional manipular blocks, drove inward, believing they were breaking the Carthaginian line, but it was all a trap. Hannibal's cavalry, having routed Rome's horsemen, swung behind the advancing infantry, while his flanking forces curled inward like jaws snapping shut. In moments, the Roman army was surrounded, compressed so tightly that soldiers couldn't even raise their swords. The numbers still stagger historians: 50,000 Romans dead in a single afternoon, their bodies piled so high that Hannibal's men clambered over them to keep killing. Consul Paulus fell with them, bleeding out in the dirt. A handful of survivors fled, carrying word of the catastrophe back to a city now gripped by panic. For the first time, Rome faced the unthinkable, an enemy at its gates with no army left to stop him. Yet Cannae's true lesson wasn't just about battlefield tactics, it was about adaptability. Rome's leaders had clung to the same brute force strategies that worked against lesser foes, refusing to innovate even as Hannibal outmaneuvered them again and again. Their arrogance cost them an entire generation of soldiers, but here's the twist: Rome's eventual recovery revealed a different kind of strength. Instead of charging headlong into another disaster, they adopted a strategy of delay, avoiding pitched battles while harassing Hannibal's supply line. It was a grudging admission that sometimes survival means swallowing your pride. Ironically, Carthage would later mirror Rome's early mistakes. After years of victories, Hannibal's own homeland grew complacent, failing to reinforce him when Rome finally took the fight to Africa. The same overconfidence that doomed Rome at Cannae would doom Carthage at Zama, proving that in war, no empire is immune to the slow poison of arrogance. And as we'll see next, even the greatest conquerors can falter when they mistake luck for skill. The dense forests of Germania seemed like just another frontier for Rome to tame, until they became the graveyard of 3 legendary legions. In the year 9 of the Common Era, Governor Publius Quinctilius Varus led 17,000 of Rome's finest soldiers deep into the wilderness, confident that the local tribes would bow to imperial might. What he didn't know was that his most trusted advisor, the Germanic chieftain Arminius, had spent years earning Rome's trust only to set the stage for one of history's most devastating ambushes. The betrayal unfolded like a nightmare. Marching through the rain-soaked Teutoburg Forest, Varus' columns stretched for miles along narrow, muddy paths, perfect terrain for an ambush. Arminius, who had grown up in Rome as a hostage-turned Dalai, knew exactly how the legions fought. he convinced Varus to take a detour under the guise of putting down a minor rebellion, leading the Romans straight into a trap. Germanic warriors hidden in the trees unleashed a storm of javelins and arrows, then charged from all sides, using the thick undergrowth to negate Rome's disciplined formations. Tacitus later wrote of the horror, soldiers slipping in blood-soaked mud, their heavy armor useless in close-quarter chaos. For 3 days, the slaughter continued as the legions tried and failed to break free. By the end, not a single Roman unit survived intact. Varus, realizing his mistake, fell on his sword rather than face capture. The few survivors who escaped brought word of the catastrophe back to Rome, where Emperor Augustus reportedly wandered his palace crying, "Varus, give me back my legions." But Teutoburg's impact went far beyond a single battle. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a cultural turning point. Rome had never fully conquered Germania, but after this disaster, they abandoned the region entirely, drawing the imperial border at the Rhine. The loss reshaped Europe's map, ensuring Germanic tribes would remain independent, their cultures evolving outside Roman influence. Centuries later, these same tribes would play a key role in the empire's collapse. What makes Teutoburg so haunting is how preventable it was. Varus ignored warnings about Arminius' loyalty, dismissing them as paranoia. He assumed barbarians couldn't outthink Rome, forgetting that Arminius had been trained by the empire itself. It's a pattern we've seen before: overconfidence blinding leaders to danger until it's too late. And it wasn't unique to Europe. Far to the east, similar ambushes would cripple Chinese armies during the Han Dynasty, proving that no empire, no matter how advanced, is immune to the treachery of familiar faces and familiar terrain. The forest didn't just hide warriors, it exposed the fragility of imperial arrogance. The mighty Yangtze River had never witnessed a spectacle like this. In the winter of 208 of the Common Era, the warlord Cao Cao stood poised to unite all of China under his banner. With an armada of thousands of ships and nearly 200,000 troops, his forces dwarfed the combined armies of his rivals, Sun Quan and Liu Bei. Victory seemed certain until one fatal miscalculation turned the waters red with more than just sunset. Cao Cao, a brilliant strategist, had an ingenious solution for his troops' seasickness, chaining his ships together into floating fortresses. The plan worked perfectly until it became a death sentence. The rival commanders Zhu Yu and Zhu Liang saw their chance. As the romance of the Three Kingdoms dramatically recounts, they sent a defector to Cao Cao with a fake offer to surrender, then launched fire ships vessels packed with oil and dry reeds straight into the immobilized fleet. A sudden wind fanned the flames, and within hours, the linked ships became an inferno so vast it turned the river to fire. Panicked soldiers leaped into the water only to drown under the weight of their armor, while those who stayed burned alive. The defeat was absolute, but Red Cliffs wasn't just a tactical blunder, it reshaped history. Cao Cao's dream of a unified China shattered that night, cementing the division of the land into 3 warring kingdoms. The battle became a symbol of how over-engineering can backfire spectacularly. Cao Cao had sought control, but in eliminating one weakness, his troops' instability on water, he created a far deadlier vulnerability. The parallels to other naval disasters are striking. Like the Spanish Armada centuries later, Cao Cao's fleet fell victim to an opponent who understood the environment better. The wins that day weren't just whether they were a force multiplier for an outnumbered fleet willing to think creatively. And as we'll see next, nature often plays the ultimate wild card in war, whether through sudden storms or monsoon rains that drown entire campaigns in mud and despair. Because when leaders forget to respect the elements, history has a way of reminding them, with fire, water, or the slow crush of hubris. The Tang Empire stretched farther west than any Chinese dynasty before it, a glittering web of trade routes, garrisons, and client states reaching deep into Central Asia. But in 751, that ambition collided with reality on the banks of the Talas River. The battle that followed wasn't just a military defeat, it was the moment China lost its grip on the Silk Road, thanks to a disastrous mix of overconfidence and betrayal. General Gao Xianji, the Tang commander, had spent years expanding China's influence, carving out protectorates in the Fergana Valley and beyond. His army was a formidable force, disciplined infantry, skilled archers, and heavy cavalry modeled after Persia's elite cataphracts. But distance was his enemy. The Tang supply lines stretched over thousands of miles, leaving troops dependent on local allies, some of whom weren't as loyal as they seemed. When Abbasid forces marched east to challenge Tang dominance, Gao expected his Karluk mercenaries to stand firm. Instead, they switched sides mid-battle, slamming into the Tang flank and turning an orderly retreat into a rout. The Abbasids didn't just win a battle that day, they won control of Central Asia. Chinese chronicles downplay the defeat, but the aftermath tells the real story. The Tang abandoned their western outposts, their dream of a transcontinental empire crumbling overnight. Yet Talas left an unexpected legacy. Captured Chinese artisans carried the secret of papermaking to the Abbasid world, sparking a revolution in record-keeping and scholarship that would fuel Islam's golden age. A military disaster, in other words, became a cultural turning point, proof that history's twists are never predictable. What makes Talas so fascinating is how it mirrors other imperial overextensions. Like Rome in Germania or Athens in Sicily, the Tang mistook temporary conquest for permanent control, underestimating the logistical and political strains of holding distant territory. And just as the Karluks betrayed Gao, the Vikings would soon exploit similar fractures in Europe, where divided kingdoms and overstretched defenses made easy prey for raiders. Because when empires reach too far, they rarely notice the cracks until it's too late. The Viking longships came like a storm out of the north, their prows carving through the Seine as they descended upon Paris in the autumn of 885. For decades, these Norse raiders had terrorized Europe's coasts and rivers, striking with terrifying speed against undefended monasteries and towns. But Paris was different, a fortified island city straddling two massive stone bridges, the Grand Pont and Petit Pont, that controlled all river traffic. The Vikings, led by the cunning chieftain Siegfried, demanded tribute, threatening to burn the city if refused. When the Frankish bishop Goslin refused, the siege began a brutal 10-month struggle that would test both Viking ambition and Frankish ingenuity. At first, the Norsemen's tactics seemed unstoppable. They bombarded the city with fire and stone, even building makeshift siege towers to scale the walls. The annals of St. Bertin describe how the pagans filled the river with their fleet, so thickly that one could walk across the water on their ships. Yet for all their ferocity, the Vikings hit an obstacle they couldn't overcome: those twin bridges. Goslin's defenders had fortified them with towers and barricades, turning the narrow passageways into deadly choke points. Every Viking assault was met with boiling oil, arrows, and stones hurled from above. Time and again, the Franks rebuilt what the invaders destroyed, their resilience turning the siege into a war of attrition. By the summer of 886, the Vikings were exhausted. Their usual strategy, strike fast, loot, and retreat, had failed against a prepared enemy. When the Frankish king Charles the Fat finally arrived with reinforcements, Siegfried accepted a payment of 700 pounds of silver to withdraw. It was a costly bribe, but the real victory lay in what the siege revealed. Europe was learning to fight back. the bridges of Paris became a blueprint for feudal defense, inspiring a wave of castle building across the continent. Stone walls, not wooden palisades, would now define the landscape, a direct response to Viking mobility. Yet the siege also exposed a paradox. While Paris held firm, other Frankish nobles, eager to rid themselves of the Norsemen, began paying them to raid elsewhere. This short-term thinking only emboldened future attacks, proving that gold could be as dangerous as steel. And as we'll see next, even faith could become a double-edged sword. When religious zeal blinded leaders to reality, the consequences could be just as catastrophic as any Viking raid. Because in war, whether the weapon is an axe or an idea, overreach is always the deadliest foe. The First Crusade had ended in triumph, Christian knights seizing Jerusalem from the Fatimids in a bloody siege that shocked the Islamic world. But the follow-up, the so-called Crusade of 1101, would prove how quickly victory can unravel when zeal outpaces strategy. This wasn't a single campaign, but a chaotic patchwork of armies: Lombards, French, and Germans, each arriving separately, each convinced God would grant them glory. Byzantine Princess Anna Komnene, watching from Constantinople, captured the farce in her chronicles. They came not as a river, but as scattered drops, and the Turks swallowed them whole. The Lombards were the first to march into disaster. Ignoring Byzantine advice to wait for reinforcements, they charged blindly into Anatolia, where the Seljuk Turks shadowed them like wolves. At Mercivan, the Crusaders made camp in an indefensible valley, their leaders squabbling over command. The Turks, masters of hit-and-run warfare, cut off their water supply, then rained arrows from the hills. Anna writes of Lombard knights, their heavy armor baking in the sun, collapsing from thirst before the slaughter even began. The few survivors straggled back to Byzantine territory, blaming everyone but themselves. Next came the French under William of Nevers, who repeated the same mistakes. Refusing to coordinate with the Lombards' remnants, he led his forces straight into another Seljuk ambush at Heraclea. The Turks feigned retreat, luring the Crusaders into a narrow pass where their cavalry was useless. William's army was annihilated so completely that rumors spread he'd vanished into the wilderness, a ghostly warning against pride. The final blow fell on the Germans near Iregli. Their leader, Welf of Bavaria, had at least tried to learn from others' failures, but it was too late. The Seljuks, now emboldened, attacked with relentless precision. Chronicler Albert of Ochen describes knights dismounting to fight on foot, only to be surrounded and cut down. The few who reached Antioch brought tales of horror, further demoralizing the already strained Crusader states. Jerusalem paid the price for these disasters. With so many reinforcements wiped out, the kingdom's borders became dangerously thin. The Fatimids, sensing weakness, launched raids that stretched the Crusaders' dwindling manpower to the breaking point. And the Byzantines, disillusioned by the Crusaders' arrogance, began withholding support, a rift that would haunt Christendom for centuries. This wasn't just a military failure, it was a collapse of unity. The Crusade of 1101 exposed the fatal flaw in holy war. Without discipline, even the purest faith becomes fuel for disaster. And as we'll see next, the Mongols, masters of discipline, would themselves falter when they forgot the lessons of coordination and terrain. Because in war, whether the cause is God or conquest, disarray is the enemy no army can outrun. The Mongol tide had seemed unstoppable. Cities reduced to ash, empires swallowed whole, their horse archers sweeping across Asia like a force of nature. By 1260, Hulagu Khan's armies had crushed Baghdad, extinguished the assassins, and stood poised to overrun the last Muslim stronghold in their path, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. But in the dusty hills of Ain Jalut, history pivoted. Here, the Mongols would meet their first decisive defeat, not by some grand alliance, but by a brilliant deception that exploited their greatest weakness, their own unshakable confidence. The Mamluks, former slave soldiers who now ruled Egypt, were the only force left standing between the Mongols and the Mediterranean. Their commander, Sultan Qutuz, knew he couldn't match the Mongols in open battle. So he turned their tactics against them when the two armies clashed near the springs of Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath. The Mamluk general Baybars executed a masterstroke. He ordered a feigned retreat, a maneuver the Mongols themselves had perfected. The Mongols, smelling victory, charged headlong into the trap. As they pursued, Mamluk cavalry hidden in the surrounding hills closed in from all sides, pinning the invaders against rough terrain where their famed mobility meant nothing. Hulagu's absence sealed the disaster. Just months earlier, he'd withdrawn the bulk of his forces to settle a succession crisis after his brother Mong's death. The army left behind at Ain Jalut was a shadow of the Mongol horde, outnumbered, undersupplied, and led by Kitbuka, a general whose arrogance rivaled his skill. When the Mamluks sprung their trap, Kitbuka refused to retreat, convinced no mere slaves could best the heirs of Genghis. His defiance turned a setback into a slaughter. By day's end, the Mongols' western advance lay broken, their aura of invincibility shattered. The ripple effects were immediate. Ain Jalut didn't just save Egypt, it reshaped the world's balance of power. For the first time, a Mongol army had been not just repelled but annihilated, their corpses left to bake under the Palestinian sun. The Mamluks, emboldened, pushed north, reclaiming Syria and sending a message: the Mongol tide could be turned. Meanwhile, Hulagu's dreams of a Mediterranean empire crumbled as civil war consumed the Mongols' heartland. The Ilkhanate would never recover its momentum, fracturing into squabbling factions. Yet Ain Jalut's deeper lesson wasn't about battle tactics, it was about logistics and loyalty. The Mamluks won because they knew the land and fought for their homeland. The Mongols lost because they'd stretched too far, their supply lines frayed, their leadership divided. It's a pattern we've seen before, from Athens in Sicily to Rome in Germania, where empires falter not from lack of strength, but from forgetting the costs of overreach. And as we'll see next, even the mightiest siege engines mean nothing when the defenders refuse to break, and the walls themselves become a weapon. Suleiman the Magnificent had spent years preparing for this moment, the conquest of Vienna, the glittering prize that would pry open the heart of Europe for the Ottoman Empire. In the autumn of 1529, his army marched north, a colossal force of over 100,000 men, dragging with them the largest siege cannons ever forged. Yet within weeks, that same army would be slogging through mud, their supplies rotting, their guns silent, as Vienna's defenders laughed from the walls. How did the most powerful military machine of its age falter so spectacularly? The answer lies not in the strength of the city's defenses, but in the fatal haste of Suleiman's ambition. Ottoman chroniclers like Kemal Pashazade later wrote of a campaign plagued by relentless rain, turning the roads into quagmires that slowed the advance to a crawl. Supply wagons sank axle-deep, while dysentery ravaged the ranks. Worse, the grand siege guns, the weapons meant to reduce Vienna's medieval walls to rubble, arrived too late, their massive weight making them nearly impossible to drag through the muck. By the time the Ottomans reached the city, their artillery was useless, their troops exhausted, and winter was closing in. Suleiman, refusing to admit defeat, ordered assault after assault, but without breaching the walls, his men were cut down in droves by Habsburg arquebusiers. The siege collapse wasn't just a tactical blunder, it was a logistical nightmare. The Ottomans had conquered vast territories by mastering supply lines, yet here, their usual efficiency unraveled. Contemporary diaries describe soldiers butchering their own pack animals for food, while the Janissaries, the empire's elite corps, grumbled openly about the Sultan's stubbornness. When Suleiman finally ordered a retreat, his army left behind not just cannons but thousands of corpses, half buried in the autumn mud. Vienna's survival sent shockwaves through Europe. For the first time, Christendom realized the Ottoman juggernaut could be stopped not by miracles but by patience and preparation. The Habsburgs, emboldened, launched counteroffensives that slowly pushed the Ottomans back from Hungary. But the real lesson was one of timing. Suleiman had gambled on speed, ignoring the seasons, the terrain, and the limits of his own supply chain. It was a mistake empires keep making, from Napoleon's frozen retreat from Moscow to Hitler's stalled tanks at Stalingrad. Because when ambition outpaces logistics, even the mightiest armies starve. And as we'll see next, the sea offers no refuge from such folly. Naval history is littered with campaigns where the waves, not the enemy, delivered the deadliest blows, where storms, thirst, or simple misnavigation turned triumph into tragedy. Because whether on land or water, overreach is the oldest enemy of all. Philip II of Spain called it the enterprise of England, a holy crusade to overthrow the Protestant heretic Elizabeth and return the island to Catholic rule. His armada was the most formidable fleet ever assembled, 130 ships, 19,000 soldiers, and a battle plan blessed by the Pope himself. Yet within weeks, that same fleet would be scattered like driftwood across the North Sea, its sailors freezing, starving, and cursing the storms that seemed to fight for England. How did the greatest naval force of its age crumble so completely? The answer lies not in English cannons, but in the fatal collision of Spanish rigidity and nature's fury. The Spanish plan was meticulous on paper. The Armada would sail up the English Channel, link up with the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands, then ferry 30,000 troops across the narrow strait to Kent. But from the start, the sea mocked their precision. Winds delayed their departure for months, and when they finally reached the Channel, the English fleet, smaller, faster, and manned by seasoned privateers like Francis Drake, refused to engage in the pitched battle Spain craved. Instead, they harassed the Armada's flanks, picking off stragglers while staying just out of range of Spain's heavy guns. Then came the fireships. On the night of July 28th, under cover of darkness, the English set 8 blazing hulks adrift toward the anchored Armada. Spanish Captain Don Francisco de Bobadilla later wrote of the panic. The sky itself seemed aflame. Men cut their cables in terror, ships collided in the chaos, and by dawn our formation was shattered. The disciplined crescent that had guarded the Armada for weeks now lay in disarray just as the winds shifted. A gale blew the scattered Spanish ships northward, where they had no choice but to circumnavigate the British Isles to return home. What followed was pure horror. The storms that had dogged the Armada now became its executioner. Off the coast of Ireland, ship after ship foundered on rocky shores. Survivors who staggered onto land were often butchered by locals or handed over to English authorities. Letters from Spanish captains, preserved in archives, speak of men eating rope and drinking seawater, of decks slick with blood from scurvy-ravaged gums. By the time the remnants limped back to Spain, half the fleet and 2/3 of its men were gone. England's victory wasn't just military, it was psychological. The Protestant wind, as London called it, cemented Elizabeth's rule and emboldened English ambitions overseas. Within decades, English merchants would plant the seeds of an empire that dwarfed Spain's, while Spanish prestige never fully recovered. Yet the Armada's failure wasn't just about bad weather. It was about a system so inflexible that when Plan A failed, there was no Plan B. Philip had micromanaged every detail from his palace, ignoring his admiral's warnings about the channel's treacherous currents and the English Navy's growing skill. This pattern of rigid plans shattered by unpredictable nature repeats throughout military history. Napoleon's invasion of Russia faltered in the snow, Hitler's tanks drowned in the Russian mud. Even the Mongols, masters of adaptability, saw their invasion of Japan vanish in a typhoon, because when commanders mistake control for strategy, the elements often have the final word. And as we'll see next, even the most brilliant tacticians can be undone by something as simple as a misplaced map or a commander's refusal to listen. Proof that in war, arrogance is the one enemy no armor can deflect. The night of September 21st, 1788, should have been routine for the Austrian army camped near Caransebe's. Emperor Joseph II's forces were preparing to confront the Ottomans in yet another chapter of their centuries-long rivalry. But what unfolded wasn't just a military blunder. It was a dark comedy of errors so absurd it's hard to believe it actually happened. As the army settled in, a group of hussars decided to celebrate their upcoming campaign with a generous supply of schnapps. Meanwhile, infantrymen from another unit, many of whom spoke different languages, German, Hungarian, Romanian, grew suspicious when they heard the hussars' raucous laughter. Tensions flared. A drunken argument over alcohol escalated into shoves, then punches. Then someone shouted the word no soldier ever wants to hear in the dark: Turks. Chaos erupted. In the pitch-black night, soldiers mistook their own comrades for Ottoman attackers. Officers screamed orders in German, but the multilingual troops couldn't understand them. A cannon crew, convinced the camp was under assault, loaded and fired into the confusion. Panic spread like wildfire. Men shot at shadows, stabbed at silhouettes, and fled in every direction. By dawn, the battle was over, but the cost was staggering. Historians estimate over 10,000 Austrians were killed or wounded, not by the Ottomans, but by their own brothers in arms. When news reached Emperor Joseph, he reportedly buried his face in his hands, muttering, "Even my enemies couldn't have devised a humiliation this complete." Caransebe's wasn't just a tragic farce, it exposed the Habsburg Empire's fatal weakness: disunity. An army fractured by language barriers, poor communication, and lax discipline couldn't hope to stand against a cohesive enemy. The Ottomans, upon discovering the carnage days later, simply walked into the abandoned camp, bewildered by the self-inflicted devastation. The battle became a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumption and confusion in war. Leaders who assume their orders will be understood, or that their troops will act rationally under stress, invite disaster. This same lesson would echo decades later, when another emperor's overconfidence led to catastrophe. Napoleon, like Joseph, believed his armies were invincible until the snows of Russia proved otherwise. Because whether it's drunken hussars or freezing grenadiers, history shows that the greatest threats often come not from the enemy, but from within. Napoleon's Grand Army was the most formidable fighting force Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men drawn from across the French Empire, a veteran corps hardened by years of victories from Austerlitz to Wagram. When they crossed the Niemen River into Russia in June 1812, confidence ran so high that some officers packed parade uniforms for their anticipated entry into Moscow. Yet within 6 months, that same army would be reduced to a starving, freezing rabble, retreating through snowdrifts littered with the corpses of their comrades. How did the greatest military mind of his age lead his men into such catastrophe? The answer lies not in Russian strength, but in Napoleon's fatal disregard for the oldest enemy of all, the land itself. From the outset, the campaign was a logistical nightmare. Historian Karl von Clausewitz, who witnessed the invasion firsthand, later wrote that Napoleon's plan relied on living off the land, foraging supplies from captured Russian towns. But the Russians, under General Barclay de Tolly, adopted a brutal strategy of scorched earth. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, wells poisoned. French supply wagons, stretched over hundreds of miles of dirt roads, couldn't keep pace with the advancing army. Men and horses began dying of exhaustion and hunger long before they reached Smolensk. By August, dysentery and typhus ravaged the ranks, turning the march into a death march. The capture of Moscow in September should have been the crowning achievement, but it was a hollow victory. The city, deliberately set ablaze by Russian Governor Rostopchin, offered no shelter, no supplies, just smoldering ruins. Napoleon waited 5 weeks for Tsar Alexander to surrender, but the offer never came. As winter descended, the retreat began, and Russia's true ally General Winter took the field. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius. Horses froze mid-step, men collapsed into snowbanks too weak to rise. The once proud Grand Armée disintegrated into mobs of desperate survivors, stripping the dead for rags to wrap around their frostbitten feet. Clausewitz's analysis cuts to the heart of the failure. No army is stronger than its supply lines. Napoleon, the master of battlefield tactics, had neglected the unglamorous science of logistics. His arrogance blinded him to the reality that no amount of genius could outmaneuver starvation and frostbite. The survivors who limped back across the Niemen in December numbered barely 20,000, a loss so staggering it shattered French dominance in Europe. Yet the cruelest irony came a year later at Leipzig, where Napoleon's outnumbered forces faced a coalition of vengeful enemies. Deprived of the veteran troops lost in Russia, his makeshift army buckled under the weight of its own exhaustion. The Battle of Nations wasn't just a defeat, it was the inevitable collapse of an empire that had stretched itself too thin. Napoleon's fate mirrored that of Charles XII of Sweden a century earlier. Another would-be conqueror broken by the Russian winter. This pattern of brilliant commanders undone by their refusal to respect basic realities repeats throughout history. From Hannibal's Alps crossing to Hitler's Operation Barbarossa, the lesson remains the same. No amount of tactical genius can compensate for logistical arrogance. Because when leaders mistake ambition for strategy, the land itself becomes their executioner. And as we'll see next, even the most disciplined armies can crumble when their leaders forget that war isn't just about winning battles, it's about surviving them. Into the Valley of Death rode the 600. Alfred Lord Tennyson's immortal words capture the tragic grandeur of the charge of the Light Brigade, a blunder so infamous it became shorthand for military incompetence. The Crimean War was already a messy affair, poorly supplied troops, rampant disease, and bickering commanders, but the morning of October 25, 1854, would cement its place in history as a cautionary tale of miscommunication. The disaster began with a misunderstanding wrapped in arrogance. Lord Raglan, the British commander, watched from a distant hill as Russian forces attempted to retreat with captured artillery pieces. Determined to stop them, he scribbled a vague order instructing Lord Lucan's cavalry to advance rapidly to the front and prevent the enemy's withdrawal. But from Lucan's position, the front was unclear. Was it the guns on the heights or those at the far end of the valley? Raglan's aide, Captain Nolan, delivered the order with such impatient disdain that Lucan, resentful of being treated like a subordinate, chose the worst possible interpretation. Without questioning or clarifying, he directed the Light Brigade, 670 men under Lord Cardigan, straight into a mile-long corridor flanked by Russian cannons on 3 sides. What followed was less a battle than a slaughter. The brigade charged into a storm of grape shot and rifle fire, their sabers useless against artillery. Nolan, realizing the error, galloped ahead in a desperate attempt to redirect them, only to be torn apart by the first volley. Survivors later described horses collapsing mid-stride, men vaporized by direct hits, and the stench of burning flesh as Russian gunners reloaded with merciless efficiency. In 20 minutes, over 100 were dead, another 160 wounded, and nearly 400 horses lost. The survivors who reached the Russian guns found themselves too few to hold the position, forced to retreat under relentless fire. Yet the charge's legacy wasn't just its carnage, it was the shockwaves it sent through military doctrine. For the first time, journalists like William Howard Russell reported the blunder in near real time, their dispatches fueling public outrage. The British Army, long resistant to reform, was forced to confront its systemic failures, opaque hierarchies, toxic officer rivalries, and a culture that punished questions as insubordination. Within years, reforms modernized command structures, emphasizing clear communication and merit over aristocratic privilege. But the Crimean War's failures didn't end at Balaclava. As European powers scrambled for global dominance, colonial campaigns would expose even deadlier flaws, where arrogance and cultural ignorance turned supposed superiority into bloody farce. Because when empires assume their tactics are infallible, the results are written not in poetry but in graves. The sun burned mercilessly over the rocky outcrop of Isandlwana on January 22, 1879, as British redcoats lounged in their tents, oblivious to the approaching storm. Lord Chelmsford, confident in his Maxim guns and disciplined volleys, had split his forces, leaving the camp thinly defended while he chased phantom Zulu armies. Scouts reported movement in the hills, but the warnings were dismissed. How could spears and shields threaten the might of the British Empire? Then, like a flood unleashed, 20,000 Zulu warriors emerged in perfect formation, their war cries shaking the ground. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a massacre that shattered colonial arrogance and rewrote the rules of warfare. Survivors' accounts paint a chilling picture. Lieutenant Horace Smith Dorian described the moment the Zulu impis, the famed Horns of the Buffalo formation, closed in. They came not as a mob, but as a machine, silent until the last 100 yards, then a roar that froze the blood. The British, trained for orderly volleys at distance, were unprepared for the sheer speed and ferocity of close-quarters combat. Bayonets proved useless against the Zulus' Ikalwa-stabbing spears, designed to twist viciously in wounds. As the lines crumbled, chaos took over. Quartermaster Edward Essex watched in horror as ammunition boxes, locked tight with bureaucratic precision, couldn't be opened in time. Soldiers fought back-to-back with knives and rifle butts until the last man fell. By afternoon, over 1,300 British and Allied troops lay dead, their bodies stripped and mutilated in a ritual of victory. The Zulus, though suffering heavy losses themselves, had achieved the unthinkable. Isandlwana's aftermath sent shockwaves through colonial military doctrine. Suddenly, the myth of European invincibility was dead. The British, humiliated, abandoned their tight formations in favor of fortified loggers, circles of wagons that negated the Zulus' encirclement tactics. Firepower became gospel. Every subsequent colonial campaign emphasized machine guns and artillery over bayonet charges, but the deeper lesson went unlearned. Even as the British adapted, they clung to the belief that technology alone guaranteed victory, a delusion that would haunt them decades later in the trenches of World War I, where machine guns would slaughter men just as efficiently as Zulu spears had at Isandlwana. The battle's legacy is a paradox. It exposed the fragility of imperial power, yet also reinforced a brutal truth. Underestimating an enemy's adaptability is the quickest path to disaster. The Zulus, dismissed as savages, had mastered terrain, timing, and psychological warfare elements no amount of rifle drills could counter. And as the sun set on Isandlwana's blood-soaked field, it cast a long shadow forward, foreshadowing the deadlier miscalculations awaiting Europe's empires in the 20th century. Because whether facing spears or shells, the greatest danger is never the weapon, it's the arrogance of those who wield them. The beaches of Gallipoli should have been the Allies' gateway to victory, a daring amphibious strike to knock the Ottoman Empire out of World War I and open a supply route to Russia. Instead, they became a butcher's yard where the blood of young soldiers from Australia, New Zealand, Britain, and France stained the sand for 8 grueling months. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, had championed the campaign with characteristic boldness, convinced that naval power alone could force the Dardanelles Strait. But when ships failed, the hastily planned land invasion became a lesson in how not to wage amphibious warfare, a catastrophe etched in the diaries of those who lived through the horror. Private Eric Boggle's haunting lyrics in the band played Waltzing Matilda capture the grim reality, and the dead and the dying lay everywhere on the ground. Anzac troops, many experiencing combat for the first time, found themselves pinned beneath cliffs, their landing maps rendered useless by the chaotic currents that scattered boats miles off course. Turkish machine gun nests positioned by the brilliant young officer Mustafa Kemal, later known as Atatürk, had clear lines of fire down the narrow beaches. One Australian digger wrote home, "They mowed us down like wheat before the scythe. We couldn't advance, we couldn't retreat, the sea behind us was red." The Allies' initial plan, to overwhelm the Ottomans with sheer momentum, collapsed within hours, replaced by a nightmarish stalemate of trench warfare as deadly as the Western Front. Churchill's strategic miscalculations were staggering. Intelligence on Turkish defenses was laughably outdated, assuming outdated fortifications and demoralized troops. Instead, the Ottomans, forewarned by Allied delays, had fortified every ridge with interlocking fields of fire. Naval bombardments intended to soften defenses barely scratched the hidden artillery positions. And the lack of specialized landing craft soldiers waded ashore from repurposed fishing boats turned the operation into a lethal farce. By the time the last Allied troops evacuated in January 1916, over 130,000 men had died for a few square miles of barren coastline. Yet Gallipoli's true legacy lies in its lessons. Modern amphibious doctrine, from the D-Day landings to the Inchon operation, was forged in response to its failures. Planners learned the hard way that success requires air superiority, precise reconnaissance, and dedicated landing vessels, none of which existed in 1915. Even the evacuation, the campaign's sole bright spot, became a model for disciplined withdrawals under fire. But the human cost was unforgivable. As one Anzac survivor later reflected, "We weren't beaten by the Turks, we were beaten by our own arrogance." That arrogance would resurface just decades later, when another ill-conceived amphibious assault, the Deep Raid of 1942, repeated Gallipoli's mistakes on a smaller, deadlier scale. Because in war, the price of ignoring history isn't just defeat, it's the waste of lives that deserved better. Singapore was called the Gibraltar of the East, a fortress so impregnable that British commanders boasted no enemy could ever take it. Massive 15-inch coastal guns pointed seaward, ready to blast any invading fleet to splinters. But in February 1942, those guns fell silent as Japanese troops pedaled into the city on bicycles, their rifles slung over their shoulders. How did the supposedly unconquerable stronghold collapse in just 7 days? The answer lies in a lethal mix of colonial arrogance and a failure to adapt, a lesson written in the blood of 80,000 Allied prisoners. General Arthur Percival, Singapore's commander, was convinced the real threat came from the sea. The island's defenses mirrored Britain's own coastal artillery designed to repel battleships, not infantry. When Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita invaded Malaya instead, Percival dismissed reports of his advance, insisting the jungle was impassable. But Yamashita's troops, many on bicycles, moved with terrifying speed along plantation roads, bypassing British strongpoints. They carried minimal supplies, living off captured rations, while Percival's forces, reliant on centralized depots, found themselves cut off and starving. By the time the Japanese reached Singapore's landward side, the coastal guns, their barrels fixed seaward, were useless. Churchill would later call it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The surrender of 80,000 troops to a force half their size wasn't just a military failure, it shattered the myth of European invincibility in Asia. Overnight, colonial subjects saw their rulers humiliated, their power exposed as a facade. The psychological impact rippled across the continent, fueling independence movements from India to Indonesia. Singapore's fall didn't just lose a base, it accelerated the end of an empire. Yet the real tragedy was its preventability. Yamashita's forces were exhausted, their supply lines stretched to breaking. His infamous bluff demanding surrender while secretly low on ammunition worked only because Percival, paralyzed by indecision, refused to counterattack. Intelligence failures compounded the disaster. British maps ignored the island's northern jungles, assuming they were natural barriers. But assumptions, as we've seen time and again, are the death of strategy. And as the next failure would prove, even the most meticulous plans crumble when you underestimate the enemy or overestimate your own secrets. Operation Barbarossa began with the kind of confidence that borders on delusion. On June 22, 1941, 3 million German soldiers surged across the Soviet border in the largest invasion force history had ever seen. Fresh off their blitzkrieg victories in France, the Nazis expected another quick triumph. Stalin's colossus with feet of clay would crumble in weeks. Early successes seemed to confirm it. Entire Soviet armies encircled at Minsk and Kiev, millions of prisoners taken, the Wehrmacht advancing hundreds of miles by autumn. But beneath these staggering numbers lurked fatal flaws Hitler refused to see until snow began falling on his stranded tanks. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Germany's panzer divisions, saw disaster coming. His memoirs describe supply lines stretching thousands of miles, trucks breaking down on unpaved Russian roads, and most critically, fuel shortages so severe that armored columns sometimes sat idle for days. The Soviets, meanwhile, traded space for time, relocating factories east of the Urals while fresh Siberian divisions trained in secret. By December, temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Celsius. German machine guns froze solid. Soldiers wrapped newspaper under their uniforms for insulation. The infamous General Winter had arrived, and with it, the turning point of the war. Hitler's miscalculations were staggering in their consistency. He ignored Napoleon's lessons about Russian distances, dismissed intelligence on Soviet reserves, and gambled everything on a single knockout blow. When Moscow didn't fall by Christmas, the plan unraveled. The Red Army's counteroffensive at the gates of Moscow in December 1941 wasn't just a setback, it exposed the Reich's fatal overextension. German troops, ordered to hold every inch of ground, couldn't retreat to defensible positions. The result, a grinding war of attrition that Germany, with its dwindling resources, could never win. The ripple effects reshaped the 20th century. Barbarossa's failure didn't just doom the Third Reich, it propelled the Soviet Union to superpower status, setting the stage for the Cold War. And here's the bitter irony. Hitler, who feared Bolshevism above all else, handed Stalin control of half of Europe by overreaching just as Napoleon had. The parallels are haunting two conquerors separated by a century, making the same catastrophic bet on Russian weakness, but the lesson runs deeper than geography or weather. Barbarossa was a failure of imagination. The Nazis, convinced of their racial and tactical superiority, couldn't fathom an enemy as resilient as the Soviet people. They planned for a campaign, not a war, and when reality refused to conform to their arrogance, the Eastern Front became a meat grinder that consumed entire generations. It's a pattern we've seen before, from the Persians at Thermopylae to the Ottomans at Vienna. Underestimating an opponent's will to resist is the oldest, costliest mistake in warfare. And as the ashes of World War II settled, a new era of miscalculations dawned, one where nuclear stakes made failures even more unthinkable. Because when superpowers assume they can control events, history has a way of humbling them too. The Bay of Pigs invasion was supposed to be a swift, surgical strike, a covert operation to overthrow Fidel Castro with minimal U.S. fingerprints. Instead, it became a textbook example of how faulty intelligence and half measures can turn ambition into international humiliation. The CIA's plan, codenamed Operation Zapata, relied on two critical assumptions: that Cuban exiles landing at the Bay of Pigs would spark a popular uprising, and that air superiority would cripple Castro's defenses. Both assumptions collapsed within hours, exposing a chain of miscalculations that would haunt American foreign policy for decades. Declassified CIA post-mortems revealed just how flawed the intelligence was. Agency operatives, relying heavily on reports from exiled Cuban elites, vastly overestimated discontent under Castro. They imagined a repeat of the 1954 Guatemala coup, where a small force triggered a regime's collapse. But Cuba wasn't Guatemala. Castro's grip was tighter, his intelligence sharper. Peasants who'd benefited from land reform had little appetite for a counter-revolution, and the CIA's own radio broadcasts urging revolt, played on loop, rang hollow to locals who saw the invaders as American puppets. When Brigade 2506 hit the beaches on April 17, 1961, they found not cheering crowds but swampy terrain and waiting militias. Then came Kennedy's fateful hesitation. Originally, the plan called for extensive U.S. air support to neutralize Castro's tiny air force, but at the last moment, fearing Soviet backlash and desperate to maintain plausible deniability, JFK canceled the second wave of airstrikes. The result was catastrophic. Castro's surviving planes sank supply ships and strafed the stranded exiles, while his troops, tipped off by Cuban intelligence, sealed off escape routes. Survivors later described wading through mangroves under relentless fire, their radios crackling with unanswered pleas for help. Within 72 hours, over 100 invaders were dead and 1,200 captured. The Bay of Pigs wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a strategic wake-up call. Kennedy, humiliated, famously told aides, "Victory has 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan." The CIA's reputation took years to recover, and the fiasco directly influenced later proxy wars, from Nicaragua to Afghanistan, where policymakers prioritized local buy-in over wishful thinking. But the deeper lesson echoes ancient failures like the Sicilian Expedition or the Crusade of 1101. Interventions built on cultural ignorance and rosy assumptions rarely survive contact with reality. Espionage history is littered with such blunders. Just as Persian scouts underestimated Greek unity at Thermopylae, or Napoleon's spies misread Russian resilience, the CIA's Cuba team fell victim to confirmation bias, seeing what they wanted to see. The difference in the nuclear age, miscalculations don't just cost battles, they risk global catastrophe. And as the next failure would prove, even superpowers can't outrun the consequences of hubris, especially when their enemies are watching and learning. The desert sun blazed mercilessly over Carrhae in 53 before the Common Era, turning the sand into a shimmering furnace, the perfect killing ground for Rome's greatest humiliation. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in the Republic, had marched his legions eastward dreaming of conquests to rival Pompey's. Gold, not glory, fueled his ambition. The Parthian Empire's wealth was legendary, and Crassus, desperate to outshine his political rivals, ignored every warning. Even the local Armenians, who knew the Parthians' deadly skill with the composite bow, begged him to take a mountain route. But Crassus, dismissive of barbarian tactics, insisted on crossing the open Mesopotamian plain. It was a decision that would doom 7 legions to a new kind of hell. Plutarch's account paints a harrowing scene. The Parthian general Shauna, outnumbered but brilliant, unleashed waves of horse archers who circled the Roman squares like vultures. The air itself seemed to darken with arrows, he wrote, while the Romans, parched and panicked, found no enemy to grapple with, only death whistling down from the sun. Crassus' son Publius led a desperate cavalry charge to break the archers, only to be lured into a trap, his severed head hurled back into the Roman lines by laughing Parthians, shattered morale. By nightfall, 20,000 legionaries lay dead or dying, their heavy armor useless against the very mobility Crassus had mocked. The survivors, their hands nailed to crosses by Parthian blacksmiths, became ghastly monuments to arrogance. Carrhae's aftermath reshaped Rome's power structure overnight. Crassus' death shattered the fragile triumvirate with Pompey and Caesar, removing the one man who might have mediated their rivalry. Within years, civil war would erupt, ending the Republic and birthing the Empire. But the battle's true legacy was tactical. For the first time, Rome faced an enemy whose warfare was pure asymmetry, no fixed formations to outmaneuver, no supply lines to cut, just endless arrows and feigned retreats. The lesson was clear: wealth and numbers meant nothing against adaptability. Yet Carrhae wasn't an isolated tragedy. Across the ancient world, from the steppes of Scythia to the hills of Judea, empires kept learning and forgetting this truth. The same Parthian tactics would later humble Mark Antony, while the Han dynasty, despite its unmatched resources, struggled against Xiongnu horse archers. Because whether in deserts or grasslands, the pattern repeats. When armies mistake rigidity for discipline, the land itself becomes their executioner. And as history's lesser-known failures remind us, sometimes the smallest miscalculations echo the loudest. Emperor Valens could taste victory in the dry August air outside Adrianople. His scouts had reported a ragged band of Gothic rebels, perhaps 10,000 strong, camped haphazardly near the city. Never mind that Western reinforcements under his nephew Gratian were days away. This was the moment to strike. The Eastern Roman army, 40,000 strong, marched out in sweltering heat, their heavy infantry formations confident against what they assumed would be another disorganized barbarian mob. But as historian Ammianus Marcellinus recounts, the Goths had learned from years of fighting Rome, and their cavalry, hidden beyond the hills, was about to rewrite the rules of warfare. What Valens didn't know was that the Gothic chieftain Fritigern had sent for his allies thousands of armored horsemen, many of them former Roman auxiliaries who knew the empire's tactics intimately. As the Roman legions advanced, exhausted from hours under the sun, these riders erupted from the flanks like a thunderclap. Ammianus paints a visceral scene. The cavalry, with lances couched and swords flashing, tore through our ranks as fire through dry grass. The Roman left flank collapsed instantly, while the right, packed too tightly to maneuver, became a slaughterhouse. Valens, wounded by an arrow, was carried to a nearby farmhouse, only for the Goths to burn it down with him inside. By dusk, 2/3 of Rome's eastern army lay dead, including most of its senior commanders. Adrianople wasn't just a defeat, it was a seismic shift in military history. For centuries, Roman discipline and heavy infantry had dominated battlefields. Now, the Gothic cavalry had proven that speed and mobility could shatter even the most seasoned foot soldiers. The battle heralded the age of the mounted warrior, a precursor to medieval knights who would dominate warfare for the next 1,000 years. Yet the real tragedy was its avoidability. Valens, eager for personal glory after years of political tensions with Gratian, had ignored every warning. His scouts underestimated the Gothic numbers. His officers begged him to wait for reinforcements. Even Fritigern had sent envoys offering negotiation, buying time for his cavalry to arrive. But impatience, as so often in history, bred disaster. The fallout was immediate and brutal. With the Eastern army decimated, the Goths rampaged unchecked through the Balkans, exposing Rome's vulnerability in a way no barbarian force had before. The empire would never fully recover its aura of invincibility. Within a century, the West would collapse under waves of Germanic migrations, many led by tribes who'd studied Adrianople's lessons well. But the battle's deepest irony lies in its legacy. The Goths, though victorious, couldn't replace Rome's infrastructure. Their triumph accelerated the chaos that would eventually consume them too. Because in war, as in life, winning a battle doesn't always mean winning the war, and sometimes the cost of victory is higher than defeat. Which brings us to history's most haunting question. What happens when even a last stand isn't enough, when the bravery of the doomed becomes a footnote in someone else's triumph? The answers lie in the final, fateful failures where legends were born but empires died. The July heat of 1187 was a living thing, a shimmering, suffocating force that wrapped itself around King Guy of Lusignan's Crusader army like a noose. The Christians had marched out from their stronghold at Saphuria toward Tiberias, where Saladin's forces besieged the wife of Count Raymond of Tripoli. But this wasn't just a rescue mission, it was a death march. Every step into the arid hills of Galilee took the Crusaders farther from their only source of water, while Saladin's scouts watched and waited, their patience as endless as the desert itself. Ibn al-Athir, Saladin's chronicler, described the moment the trap snapped shut. The Muslim forces had set the dry grass ablaze, choking the Crusaders with smoke as they struggled toward the twin peaks known as the Horns of Hattin. The flames seemed to leap from the earth itself, he wrote, and the Franks, already mad with thirst, found their lips cracking, their tongues swelling like rotten fruit. The Templars, the elite knights who formed the backbone of the Christian army, made a desperate charge toward Saladin's position, only to be surrounded and cut down to the last man. Their Grand Master, Gerard de Riedfort, was dragged away in chains, while King Guy and his brother Aymery were paraded before Saladin in a tent where the Sultan himself offered them chilled rosewater in a cruel mockery of their suffering. The aftermath was even more devastating than the battle itself. With the Crusader army annihilated, Saladin swept through the Holy Land like a storm. Fortresses surrendered without a fight, castles emptied of defenders. By October, Jerusalem itself, the jewel of Christendom, fell without a prolonged siege. The same city that had required rivers of blood to capture in 1099 was handed over peacefully, its inhabitants spared in a display of mercy that stunned contemporaries. Saladin's victory at Hattin didn't just erase a kingdom, it rewrote the map of the Levant. But the battle's true brilliance lay in its simplicity. Saladin hadn't won through brute force, he'd exploited Guy's impatience and the Crusaders' fatal dependence on heavy cavalry in open terrain. The same knights who had dominated the fields of Europe were useless in the dust and heat of Palestine, their armor baking them alive under the sun. It was a lesson in asymmetry, one that prefigured disasters like Napoleon in Egypt or Rommel's Africa Corps, where the land itself became a weapon. Yet Hatton also revealed another truth, the fragility of unity. The Crusader states had been riven by infighting, with Raymond of Tripoli openly feuding with Guy. Saladin, by contrast, had spent years carefully uniting Muslim factions under his banner. The battle wasn't just a clash of armies, it was a collision of cohesion against chaos. And as the dust settled over Hatton, another theater of war was already proving just as unforgiving: the sea. Because while empires rose and fell on land, naval disasters could erase entire fleets in the span of a single storm, leaving no graves, no monuments, just the indifferent waves swallowing all evidence of failure. The narrow Strait of Myeongnyong was a death trap, or at least, that's what the Japanese fleet thought as they surged forward on the morning of October 26, 1597. With 133 warships crowding the water, their commanders expected an easy slaughter. After all, what could 13 Korean ships, battered and outnumbered, possibly do against such overwhelming force? But Admiral Yi Sun-sin wasn't just any commander. He was a tactician who understood the sea itself could be his greatest weapon, and in those treacherous waters, he would engineer one of history's most lopsided victories. Japanese Admiral Kurishima's diary captures the moment reality shattered their confidence. "The current," he wrote, "turned like a living thing, dragging our ships into each other as if the waves conspired against us." He had chosen Myeongnyong precisely for its violent tidal shifts, a natural phenomenon that rendered numbers meaningless. As the Japanese vessels funneled into the strait, the tide reversed with terrifying force, spinning their tightly packed fleet into chaos. Ships collided, oars snapped, and sailors tumbled into the whirlpools below. Meanwhile, Yi's 13 ships, anchored in a tight line across the narrowest point, unleashed volley after volley of cannon fire into the drifting mass. The Japanese couldn't advance, couldn't retreat. They could only watch as their own formation became their coffin. The battle's aftermath was as decisive as it was humiliating. By day's end, 31 Japanese ships lay at the bottom of the strait, while Yi's fleet emerged virtually unscathed. Survivors spoke of the Koreans, turtle ships, ironclad vessels with spiked roofs ramming through their lines like mythical beasts. But the real innovation wasn't the ships, it was his grasp of hydrography. He'd turned the environment into an extension of his navy, proving that terrain, whether land or sea, could be the ultimate force multiplier. Myeongnyong didn't just save Korea, it reshaped the Imjin War. With their supply lines severed and morale broken, the Japanese invasion stalled, buying critical time for Korean reinforcements to regroup. Yi's victory became a rallying cry, symbolizing how ingenuity could defy impossible odds. Yet the battle's deeper lesson echoes far beyond naval warfare. From Thermopylae to Dien Bien Phu, history's greatest upsets often hinge on one side forgetting a simple truth: numbers mean nothing if you're fighting the wrong battle in the wrong place. The Japanese had the ships, the men, the firepower, but he had the current, and in the end, the sea chose the winner. Which brings us to the final, haunting question these failures all whisper: how many disasters could have been avoided if someone had simply paused just once to question their assumptions? Because whether it's a king marching into a desert or an admiral ignoring the tides, the pattern never changes. Arrogance blinds, but humility and a little creativity can turn the tide of history itself. The monsoon rains that drenched the fields of Plassey in June 1757 couldn't wash away the stench of betrayal hanging over Bengal. Nawab Siraj ad-Daula's army, 40,000 strong, outnumbered Robert Clive's East India Company forces 10-1. Yet by afternoon the battle was over, not because of British superiority, but because of a single defector whose name would become synonymous with treachery in India, Mir Jafar. Clive's own letters reveal the surreal nature of the victory. The whole affair, he wrote, was decided in so extraordinary a manner that it seems almost astonishing. Mir Jafar, Siraj's own commander, had secretly promised Clive he would withhold his troops from the fight. As the battle began, Jafar's inaction left Siraj's flanks exposed, while his artillery crews deliberately fired high, wasting their shots. When the Nawab's cavalry finally charged, Jafar's men stood aside, allowing Clive's outnumbered forces to pick them off with disciplined volleys. By midday, Siraj fled, his army in disarray. Within weeks, he'd be captured and executed, his throne handed to Mir Jafar as a British puppet. But Plassey's consequences went far beyond one man's betrayal. This wasn't just a battle, it was a corporate takeover disguised as war. The East India Company, a private trading firm, now held the keys to Bengal's vast wealth. Clive's victory granted them control of tax collection, effectively turning a commercial enterprise into a sovereign power. The company's ruthless exploitation, siphoning Bengal's riches while ignoring famine, would culminate in the catastrophic Great Bengal Famine of 1770, which killed millions. Mir Jafar, rewarded with the throne, soon learned the cost of his deal. When he resisted British demands, they replaced him with another puppet, proving that treachery, once rewarded, becomes a habit. The battle's legacy echoes through centuries. Plassey marked the moment the British transitioned from traders to rulers, planting the seed of the Raj. It exposed a painful truth: empires aren't always toppled by force alone. Sometimes they're bought, one traitor at a time, and as the sun set on that muddy field, it cast a shadow that would stretch across India for nearly 200 years. These 25 failures remind us that history isn't shaped by victories alone, but by the cracks in ambition, the moments when arrogance, miscalculation, or betrayal tip the scales. From Persia's hubris at Marathon to Mir Jafar's deal at Plassey, the pattern repeats. The greatest empires often engineer their own downfalls, because in the end, the deadliest enemy isn't the army across the field, it's the flaws we refuse to see in ourselves. History isn't just written by the victors, it's shaped by the spectacular failures that sent shockwaves through civilizations, toppling kings, birthing democracies, and redrawing the map of human progress. These 25 epic military disasters weren't just battles lost, they were hinges that swung entire eras in new directions. Imagine a world where Athens hadn't gambled away its fleet in Sicily. Would philosophy and democracy have flourished as they did? Or if Rome had heeded the warnings at Teutoburg Forest, would Europe's borders look entirely different today? Every misstep we've explored, from the arrogance of Crassus at Carrhae to the logistical blindness of Napoleon in Russia, rippled outward, leaving fingerprints on everything from art and language to the very systems of power we live under now. The patterns are impossible to ignore. Time and again, empires crumble when leaders mistake might for invincibility. Persia's hubris at Marathon, Spain's rigid pride with the Armada, Japan's dismissal of Yi Sun Sin's tactical genius, each collapse echoed the same fatal flaw: underestimating an enemy while overestimating control. But it wasn't just arrogance. Poor intelligence, like the CIA's wishful thinking in the Bay of Pigs or the British commander's ignorance of Zulu tactics, proved just as deadly. And then there's nature itself, the silent player in so many of these tragedies. Whether it was the monsoon rains drowning Ottoman ambitions at Vienna, or the Russian winter freezing Nazi dreams into nightmares, the greatest generals often forgot that the land itself fights back. Yet within these failures lie our most potent lessons. The Sicilian Expedition taught us that overreach strangles even the mightiest navies. Adrianople showed how cavalry could rewrite the rules of war overnight. And Gallipoli, a brutal reminder that no amount of firepower compensates for poor planning. These aren't dusty footnotes, they're cautionary tales with startling relevance today. Modern leaders still ignore intelligence, still dismiss cultural nuance, still gamble with supply chains. The stakes may have changed, but the playbook of failure remains eerily familiar. So why dwell on defeat? Because history's what-ifs are its most instructive gifts. Sun Tzu put it best: in war, the way to avoid what is strong is to strike what is weak. These battles remind us that strength isn't just about numbers or technology. It's about adaptability, humility, and seeing clearly. Whether you're a strategist, a student, or just someone fascinated by the past, there's power in understanding how a single misstep can alter the course of centuries. Now we'd love to hear from you. Which of these failures shocked you the most? Was it the sheer scale of Napoleon's retreat or the dark absurdity of Karanseb's? Drop a comment below, and if you're hungry for more deep dives into history's turning points, don't forget to subscribe, because the past isn't just a story, it's a mirror, and the reflections it offers might just help us navigate the battles ahead.